Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Claire Stanley and I'm delighted to be here tonight with Tom Humberstone. And we're going to be talking about his graphic novel Suzanne, which I don't know if everyone here has read it yet, but if you haven't, it's excellent. So we're just going to delve straight in. Now, for so many people who are tennis fans, the name Suzanne Lenglen is probably familiar to them because if they've watched the French Open, they know there's a court named after her. But I feel like even the most hardcore tennis fans probably not going to know much about her as a person because she's just a name that crops up, but it's from so long ago. You don't hear many people talking about her and what she achieved. And I feel like for people who aren't tennis fans, they won't know about her in the way that they know about Serena Williams or Roger Federer, for example. So for you to have written this book, you've got to have a background in tennis. There's obviously been an interest there. So I'd like to start off just by getting to know you a little bit more, Tom, and I'd like to find out what your tennis origin story is.
So I didn't play or anything. I grew up watching tennis on TV. Like I watched Wimbledon with my mum, and that's sort of all I watched, I think, for, I didn't have Sky or satellite. I wasn't able to watch any of the sort of US Open or the French Open. I think French Open was always on ITV, maybe. And then I guess around 2015, or around that sort of time, I started just being able to follow it a lot more, following more streams. And I think that sort of coincided with generally wanting to escape the world of... I was like a political cartoonist at the time, and I was trying to escape the world of politics a little and, find my way to escape into the world of sport. And so I just started following the tour a lot more closely, and that sort of led to reading more books around the subject. And so I was reading all the Agassi's memoir, Open, and I picked up again Elizabeth Wilson's book called Love Game, and it sort of takes you through the history of the game from Victorian pastime to how it's sort of evolved into the modern game. And there are a few moments where she talks about Suzanne Lenglen and all of these sort of headline sort of things that I just didn't know about her. Like you say, I just knew her because of court and that there was a statue at the French Open. And so it's talking about her relationship to fashion in that at the time I didn't realize women had to wear sort of whalebone corsets when they were playing their matches. They could barely breathe when they were playing. And so Suzanne came along and sort of, she was one of the first to sort of abandon that and start wearing very, I guess sports clothing, which you could actually play sports in. But that sort of inspired the look of sort of flappers of the 1920s. She sort of had a 180 match winning streak, which, this year, I think Iga Swiatek managed 37.
Yeah, and people were saying that was phenomenal.
Exactly, yeah. And so that's one of the biggest in the Open era. So all of these things, I think she lost 7 matches in her entire career. So those are all the big headline things, and I thought, why isn't she a household name in that respect? Because I think if you ask most people to name a sports player from the 1920s, you might come up with Babe Ruth as a player, but at the time she was bigger than Babe Ruth. She was the biggest sports star. She was sort of arguably the invention of the term sports star, and then you could argue that she was the invention of the first real celebrity at the time, and then it sort of also ties in with the fact that the world had just got out of a pandemic and a world war.
It's all sounding a bit familiar.
Yeah, and so there's this entire time everyone was ready for sort of falling in love with a big celebrity who sort of embodied the age, and everyone was ready to indulge in a bit of hedonism, and she's famous for drinking on court and going to dances and immediately after her matches and things. It all just sounded really fascinating. And as soon as I went down the wiki hole, rabbit holes of just finding out as much as I could, there's one book called The Goddess in the American Girl, which I think might be out of print, and then there's a couple of smaller books that are entirely out of print. And I was just really surprised there wasn't a lot out there about her. So I just I started researching her as much as I could, and essentially wanted to write the book that I wanted to read about her.
So, because there's not so much information out there about Suzanne, and when you read the book now, that's all the information that you're going to need on her. How did you go about finding, other than just Wikipedia and previous snippets that had been written about her, how did you go out? How did you find out all that you needed to find out about her in order to put the book together? Yeah,
it's really tricky because she died when she was 39, and so she didn't really get to write those those memoirs after her career was over. She wrote a book that was sort of an instructional book about how to play tennis. So she didn't get to talk about her own life in her own words, but there were a lot of other players from the 20s who did, and they've all got chapters on her. Then there were people like Ted Tinglin, who was a part of her sort of entourage for the majority of her career. Then there were people who were almost like the antagonists of her story, Bill Tilden, who wrote about her. And so you're sort of picking up all of these books and trying to read a little bit between the lines and find original newspapers and magazines from the time and what they were writing, find whenever she was in interviews, what she was saying. And then there's this incredible archive at the Wimbledon, at the actual venue in Wimbledon. They've got a library, this research library. So I sort of spent a couple of weeks there, and they were really helpful. They sort of dug out old letters that they had of hers. And so, yeah, it's just a question of finding certain periods of her life and then that I wanted to sort of focus on, and then just going through as many old publications and just trying to find out, vaguely try and get 2 or 3 sources to check that certain things did actually happen and that kind of thing. But it's incredibly hard. No one is alive to ask about it, and it was really tricky. But it's also it's a historical fiction in that respect. I've made up a lot of the conversations and the scenes and tried to sort of capture a version of her life, which I think is a projection of mine. But there's I think, is it Norman? There's maybe Norman Wisdom. There's a comedian who wrote a book that was entirely made up as a memoir. And he said, I decided to skip past the facts and arrive at the truth. And so I don't know if that's...
Is that what you've done?
Yeah, maybe, I think, possibly.
So how did you whittle it down into the parts of her life that you wanted to tell? Because obviously you've skipped through years and you've skipped through different areas of her tennis career. So how did you decide that you wanted to focus on those particular bits?
Yeah, that took a while. I spent a year or two just with index cards on notice boards, just trying to move bits and pieces around and figuring out what parts of her life were the things that, because after you've researched it for quite a while, you realize you could sort of spend the rest of your life doing that and procrastinating and never really starting to whittle it down. But I had to come back to the things that I found interesting and drew me to the story, and try and find ways of making someone's life fit that, and find ways of being truthful and honest about all of the things that happened to her, and not yeah, not make anything up or anything, but try and find ways of telling her story in a way that like made sense to that. So the thing that I thought, there were like 4 or 5 really important matches in her career. Like they were all important, but I think there were 4 or 5 that really like felt to me like they spoke to the themes that I wanted to talk about. And so I sort of divided those as those were the chapters, and each chapter would be framed around that match, and the conversations were happening before and after. And so I could skip through years and then update the reader with the next chapter, and all the conversations the characters were having would like catch the reader up and introduce the ideas that we're going to be discussing and looking at in this chapter. And that match sort of ends up becoming like, the crux of that idea. So yeah, that was sort of the way I figured it out as the structure.
So talk us through the process of how you actually put Suzanne together then, because I mean it's the first time I've actually really sat down and read a proper graphic novel, and it's obviously very different from just sitting and reading just words on a page. So just tell us how you actually did it.
All right.
This should take a bit of time.
yeah. Just playing for time. So I guess once I sort of figured out that structure, it was just a question of like working with, I'd sort of like transcribed a lot of my notes during the research process and started piecing together what scenes I wanted and how it was all going to work. I wrote a really, almost like a screenplay as a script, because at that time I'd been lucky enough to be awarded Creative Scotland funding to work on it. And so I used that money to hire an editor who I'd worked with on previous comics that we'd worked on at a place called The Nib, which is like political cartoon sort of site. And so my editor there, Larry Harris, she sort of agreed to come on as editor. So I knew I needed someone to sort of, it's going to be like a 2 or 3 year project, and I needed someone to be able to see the wood for the trees, like in terms of like, I knew I wasn't going to be able to do this on my own. So yeah, she came on board, and I wanted like a script that really, if you read it, you could sort of visualize the graphic novel. So I wrote that and went back and forth, had some revisions, sent it to friends and colleagues, and got like feedback, and slowly sort of like made the script as solid as possible before I sort of put pen to paper in terms of drawing it. And then there's a sort of, the whole thing was drawn digitally, which I guess I've slowly transitioned towards drawing my comics digitally now. So yeah, I did like these really fairly tight pencils, and I tend to like throw in the lettering and the colours at that stage as well, just to make sure that holistically like the whole book sort of works, and it all like colour's quite an important part of the book. And so I wanted to make sure I'd made a lot of those decisions early doors, and I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. And then you've got the inking and like tidying up the pencils and colouring and lettering and yeah.
Is there any particular part of it that was like, which bit was your favourite bit to do, or which bit did you find was the hardest part to do?
Yeah, I agree. I would say, as Sylvie has already said, I think the penciling probably, because that was the bit that involved the most thinking time, or the most creative decisions, because I was basically trying to make all of those decisions, like where all the lettering works and where to put the words on each panel and how all the panels are working, why I'm picking certain colours for certain scenes, so I made all of those decisions at that early stage because I knew that by the end of this, it's like it's a marathon of, it's like a 2-year-long drawing process. So I knew at the end I would be sort of, I'd need as many of those decisions made for me at the end. So I'd sort of like the fatigue will have set in by that point. And so yeah, I think that was like the biggest sort of amount of work. And then everything was sort of, hopefully I could sort of turn my brain off a little bit when I was inking. You can never, but at that point, like I could listen to podcasts and just sort of, it was just a matter of being at my desk drawing it, and I knew what I was doing every day, and yeah, and it was all drawn during lockdown, so that
you had plenty of time in your hands.
yeah, and it's, I guess it was in a way a nice, it was nice to have a thing, like that. I knew what I was doing every day, and that was good.
Yeah, well, that is quite nice because you've got actually something to show from like a lockdown project, which a lot of people don't have when they said they were going to do something and they didn't do it. So you actually have this now. Did you do it in order, or did you draw, bits in the middle first, or how did you do that? I can imagine when you write a book, you have to write it in order with your chapters and stuff. But is it different with the graphic novel?
Yeah, I think I did. I think I'd actually written some scenes that I knew were going to be in there, like out of order, and then pieced it together when it came to writing a script. But yeah, I think I did do the book. Yeah, largely I drew it in order. Certainly when it came to the penciling, and then I think when it comes to the inks and the colours, if there was a day when I was not feeling it, I might have picked the lighter pages, because there was, the ones that didn't have loads of buildings in the background, and not another crowd scene, that kind of thing. So I think there's a page where a ball is being dropped onto a handkerchief. That was like a nice day. Yeah, that's good.
And how long, so for a scene like that you're drawing, how long would that take to draw?
Yeah, so I generally try to stick to, I would draw, I pencil 2 pages a day, and I would ink 2 pages a day, and I would colour 2 pages a day. And sometimes I'd be able to do 3 a day, and sometimes it would be 1. Like there's one when there are just a couple of characters arriving at the hippodrome, and it's just a very complicated building to draw, and so things like that just took forever. And yeah, particularly some of the more sort of intense. Like the games where you're trying to draw, where there's a lot of sourcing images of trying to figure out, drawing her first win at Wimbledon. That was Wimbledon when it was on Walpole Road instead of Church Road, where it is now. So it was trying to find any kind of photo reference of what that structure looked like. What was centre court when it wasn't centre court, and all of that. And that was really, there's a lot of difficult stuff there.
Did you ever have times when you were doing it when you thought, I wish I'd picked something easier to draw here?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah. I mean, I think that was one of the useful things about that, because when you're writing and drawing a comic, you can generally sort of be a bit more freeform about, I'm going to write roughly what the dialogue is on this page, I know what has to happen, and then piece it together in rough thumbnails, and you're moving panels around on a small sort of, thumbnail version of it, and you're sort of piecing it together as you go, because if you're doing all parts of it, you can change the wording right up to the end, and that's a nice way of working sometimes. But with this, what was quite handy of having that script all in place is, I've completely lost the thread of what I was actually saying. But it was handy. I think that was nice.
Having the script in place allowed you to keep some sort of order to what you were doing, basically.
Yeah.
You knew. So in all your research, what was your favourite anecdote that you found out about Suzanne?
There's one in there that I like, which is, I mean, it doesn't put her in a great light, but I really liked it. A lines judge called a ball out, and she disagreed and was shouting at them and calling them names, and she was told that that person wouldn't be able to hear her because they were deaf. So she left the court and wrote insults to the line judge, and then came back and gave it to him, and then he read that and he stormed off, and she was like, "Oh, let's carry on."
She got her way.
Yeah. So it's that. But I mean, yeah, that's a good story. I don't know if I mean, that's one of the things is there were things like that, and things like the fact that her dad was quite a hard taskmaster when it came to coaching her, and he would do things like drop handkerchiefs on the other side of the net, and she would have to hit them, during her practices, and then that would become coins. She would have to be able to like run and hit the ball to the coin, and that's one of those ones where it's really hard to find like corroborative sources, because he said that was untrue, but then a couple of people said that was one of the things he did. And it's the same with that whole story with the lines judge. It's, I guess, after a while, it's like, oh, it is a good story.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's demonstrative of certain things that you're also trying to talk about in a general way as well.
Yeah. And I suppose you've got a bit of artistic license, haven't you, in doing this? So it's based on fact, I think, is what you can say.
Yeah.
Just talking about our dad, we chatted about that before we came up. So they seem to have quite certainly in the book anyway, the relationship was quite tense because he was determined she was going to be the best in the world. And even at times when it seems that she didn't want to do it, she did it to please him, and she followed the coaching method. How do you think things would have been different for her if she'd had a different coach? Or do you think if she was to have been a coach, if she'd lived longer, do you think she would have taken a different approach to her players?
Yeah, I think so. I think in her final, like the final part of her career, before she got too ill, she was teaching young students how to play the game, and I think she was interested in pursuing that. I don't know if she'd be. I don't think she would have been a hard taskmaster in the same way that he was. But yeah, I think the thing that drew me to that story, her story, is a part of that relationship, and the fact that you can see parallels with all of the modern, not all of the modern, but the way in which those often father-daughter coaching relationships happen in tennis, and how toxic they can be, and how, and they're not always like that. I'm sort of looking at the Coco Gauff relationship with her family seems really good, and seems very healthy, but you definitely see this even now, and it's very weird how things haven't changed that much in 100 years. I found a lot of parallels with modern players in that respect. But yeah, I think actually that Andre Agassi book, Open, his relationship with his dad was a good reference point for me in this, because Agassi talks about the fact that he hates tennis and couldn't figure out why he was playing it. It was just a thing that he was doing because his dad wanted him to do it. And they had some pretty intense training, and it seemed pretty cruel and unusual in the same way. Actually, I mean, nowhere near as bad as with Suzanne, actually. But but all of that was like quite interesting because at the end, you know, he realised he really did love tennis, and you know, nothing's as simple as, you know, like it was quite Suzanne, when in some of her letters and some of the ways in which she talked about her dad, she clearly loved him, clearly had a lot of love for him at the end, and the way in which his death affected her as well. And also, he, you know, their relationship was all built on, she'd only get affection from her parents or even signs of love, and sometimes food if she played well, and they would berate her from the stands if she was playing poorly, and yeah. What was the question?
There's definitely, as much as your novel tells such lovely stories of her going through her career and what she achieves, there's definitely that sort of undertone of sadness to her life, because it seems like she missed out on having that sort of proper childhood, because her dad saw people playing tennis on the Riviera and was determined she was going to be the best, and so pushed her so hard that she missed out on things that maybe like a normal 14-year-old would get. I don't know what a normal 14-year-old in 1919 would do, but
right, yeah.
I can't imagine they would just always be playing tennis.
Yeah.
So there is that sort of, there's an untold story there of the kind of sadness behind the joy that she brought to so many people. And now me talking about that, I've also lost my train of thought.
Oh, no,
So,
yeah.
We're doing really well here, aren't we?
yeah. Professionals, yeah. No.
Who would you compare her to, like in a sort of modern day age? Is there like one? I know you've said that there was the similarities there between Andre Agassi and his dad and the way that they trained, but is there anyone playing right now that you think would give her a run for her money?
Yeah. I guess I see parallels with lots of different people. So like her relationship with the press, I see a lot of parallels with Naomi Osaka, and how her relationship with the tennis press has been sort of fraught at best. And then like just people like Swiatek and Goff and Raducanu, like these teenagers who are coming up who are immediately getting all the attention and being hyped up, and how that was happening to Suzanne at the same age of, she was 19 when she won Wimbledon, and that was sort of when she like first really like broke through. So there's that. There are little things like her mum had a Belgian Griffon in the audience, and that something about that visual made me really think of Andreescu and her mum, Coco the dog. Things like that. Like, so there are little things like that, and much larger things about like the way in which like the battles against the institutions, like the fact that she was one of the first sort of big name player to go turn professional. That sort of made me think of like Venus and sort of holding Wimbledon to account over the equal pay. All sorts of like little parallels there. That yeah. It also made me think that it made me think about like the ways in which any young woman in music or film have sort of been sort of gone through this sort of like being spat out by the public and the media. Like I was thinking of like Marilyn Monroe and like Britney Spears a little bit in terms of the way that fame sort of eats you, and everyone has to sort of develop these like the second skin, this calloused sort of skin, in order to sort of deal with the ways in which people are talking about all the expectations that come from it. Like the fact that the world was England and Wimbledon in particular were scandalised by the fact that she wore like calf-length dresses and wanted to breathe on court. They obviously forgave it in the fact that she won, and
How
she became
fickle.
yeah, and she became like a huge superstar. But if that's all in the background and that's sort of in the book, it's like that's part of. So she could never lose because the public and the press would turn on her. She could never lose because her parents would turn on her. She could never lose because she actually didn't have any friends outside of tennis. So every single time she was winning a match, you know, that's where all the kind of, you know, she was living her life on her toes is what someone, I think Ted Tinlin described her as. And yeah, when you've like, got that 180 match winning streak, like the pressure just mounts because, yeah.
Yeah, and as a result, she ended up being like world #1 for, what was it, something like 7 years?
Yeah.
Which is just incredible. But it seems to be that she just constantly had that massive pressure on her shoulders to do that in a way that, you know, people now would be able to relate to, I suppose. So if she was a player now, and she was going to walk out on court, say, let's just say at the US Open because it's just finished, what would Suzanne Lenglen's walk-on song be?
Right. Yeah. I think I like the idea of Billie Eilish's You Should See Me in a Crown. Would be quite good. But it's actually it takes a long time to get going.
I feel like you need something that's going to pack a punch straight away.
Yeah. I reckon Rihanna's Diamonds would be good. I feel like that'd be quite a good walk on. Is that good?
If anyone else has got any suggestions as well, you know, keep them coming. It's always a good talking point to think what someone might walk out to. So I always wonder what they're listening to in their headphones.
Yeah.
Like what's their own walk-on song?
Yeah, right. Because my partner's really into snooker and they all have walk-on music. And yeah, they should definitely do that in all sports.
If you'd had a walk-on song tonight coming in here, what would it have been?
Carly Rae Jepsen's Too Much. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's a good
I'm happy
one.
with that. That'll be
and again, I've forgotten what I was going to ask you next, so I'm so surprised by that answer. Just in case anyone cares, mine would be Panic at the Disco, High Hopes.
Nice.
I've always got high hopes I'm not going to lose, but I usually do. So I did have one other question.
What's your
I wanted
answer
to ask
for
you.
Murray? What would you pick for Andy Murray?
Oh, for Andy Murray, what would his walk-on song be? God, anything, please don't lose, please win. Is there, Scott, what would your walk-on song be for Andy Murray?
I don't know. I feel like Andy's quite like a grungy guy, but I feel like he would probably walk on with some like cheesy pop music or something like that.
Yeah. I could have actually imagine some angry rap for Andy actually walking on stage just to really fire himself up.
Yeah.
That will be a question that we'll ask him when we get the chance.
Oh, nice.
So has doing Suzanne inspired you to do more like sports-based graphic novels?
Yeah, I think there are so many really interesting stories, particularly around that time, when a lot of the players sort of ended up also fighting in wars or being spies, and there's so many sort of interesting things around, you know, like it is really fascinating, like what constitutes a sporting legacy as well, like in terms of, and that's what drew me to the story in terms of, you know, you could have all of these amazing achievements and then no one knows your name, but you know, you were essentially like the biggest name for like 10 years in the world, and yeah, what does it all sort of mean? Mm-hmm. And I feel like sporting afterlife, like sporting legacies are so much shorter than other things. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of like really interesting stories from that time, like the 20s and 30s, that would be really interesting to talk about. I think there'd be like a good book that took lots of different stories and sort of summarised them maybe, because I don't know if I could do this again for
just one person.
Yeah, I think for my next thing, I'm a big horror fan, and I think I'd like to do a horror graphic novel. So a little bit of a left turn.
I was going to suggest that we could do an Andy Murray one. That could work for horror.
Yeah, I did actually do like a sort of it's like an 8-page comic about Andy Murray for when he might have been retiring. When was that? Like 2018?
2018, yeah.
For dark year.
Yeah. It was bad times.
It was bad times. I genuinely couldn't talk about that Australian Open press conference without like a lump in my throat as I was talking. It's ridiculous. But
I mean, you could write a graphic novel about that incident alone, to be honest. And there's your horror.
Yeah, absolutely. God, yeah. There's a good tennis journalist called Louisa Thomas who described him as a walk-in existential crisis. She's really good.
I can see Scott laughing in the background. He knows, he understands it so well. Yeah, that's really true. So just what you're saying there about a new one for horror, what do you think you would do? 'Cause it's quite a change from going from the sort of nice story of Suzanne, although like I've already said, there is an undercurrent of sadness in her story, but to go from that to like full-on horror, has that put you off so much that would the horror be your own experience of doing this?
Yeah, it's just a book about my process of drawing Suzanne, yeah. No, it's pretty amorphous in my head at the moment, but it'll be like folk horror tales, possibly. I'm quite interested in the Kelpie and doing something with that.
So like a kind of collection of short stories, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know for sure. And I'd really like to carry on doing anything that involves tennis, really. Like, it was a genuine pleasure to draw it and disappear into that world, even though obviously there's a lot of trauma there as well, within the story. But for the actual drawing of it, there were times when it felt like a slog, as anything where you're doing it every day for several years, and you're like, is this any good? I don't even know if it's any good. But it really, it was really fun, and I'd definitely do it again.
And you're pleased with the finished article?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I know I've already said this. It's so good, and when I read it, I got so caught up in the stories that I forgot how it started with her being visited by a friend and her being unwell in her bed and sort of telling her memoirs, because I felt like I was drawn into it so much. I felt like I was almost there, living the stories with her. So when it came back to the present day, so to speak, I was kind of jolted back into reality, and I got quite a shock because I think I was just expecting it to just keep on going. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and it sounds a bit cheesy to say, but thank you for doing it, because it's certainly given me insight into a player who I'd always heard about but knew nothing of. So I think I'd like to see more, and I would like to see an Andy Murray one, obviously.
If you'll write it with me.
Yeah, I will do it with you. Yeah. I'm more than happy. I would like to do a Murray's Mutterings book, which just basically consists of everything that he mutters under his breath while he's on court.
Yeah.
So if you could do the drawings...
Not safe for work.
Yeah. It wouldn't be one to take into the office with you. But if you do the drawings, I'll do the words.
Yeah.
Right, well, thank you for chatting to me. And I think we'll open up the floor to some questions now. If anyone has got a question they'd like to ask Tom, please feel free.
We've got a roving mic, so if you're going to ask a question. Anyone?
Come on, someone must have something.
Okay, great.
Hi, I'm super excited to read your book. I haven't read it yet, I'm afraid. But I wanted to ask about the colour palette, specifically because I think in this country, when we grow up watching Wimbledon, everything is green and white. And it was really fascinating to me when I started watching non-Wimbledon tennis tournaments, just like the sheer colour, the sunshine and the red clay and what have you. So can you tell us a bit about the sort of the red and the blue and the darkness?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I generally like to do a lot of my colouring with like two colours and how they sort of the different opacities overlay and sort of create a hue, like a sort of limited colour palette out of that. One of the reasons is it sort of makes it a lot of your decision making a little bit simpler in terms of like if you've got like millions of colours available, it's quite hard to sort of make a book feel coherent. But also it really like forces you to think about why you're using particular colours where, and like makes you sort of make sure that you're using the colour as a storytelling device as much as just sort of saying, well, this is what it would have looked like, I guess. So yeah, I realised like I wanted to come up with like two good like colours that would work. So I thought the red would work for the kind of like the heat of the like the Riviera vibe and the clay, and the blues could work when I'm in England and the grey skies and like like the grass as well, like and then obviously you've got all of the colours in between. You've got the pinks and the purples and like you can use those two colours to like make the interiors look a certain way, and then so what I ended up doing was when there's it's sort of set now, which is in the 30s, when we sort of start the comic, everything is just in blue tones to sort of, and all the life is sort of sucked out, essentially. And then when we go back to the 20s, everything is there, and we get to really experience all of the sort of vibrancy and the life of that period. And so you sort of, the idea is hopefully that you're like communicating these things to the reader without, subconsciously, when most of the time Suzanne is in red, and that was the sort of like colour I associated with her. It was sort of, vibrant and, full of life and a bit of anger and a bit of irritation and passion. But then, so because that's often throughout the book, occasionally when she is in blue, that's significant, and hopefully, and then whenever there's like a match, the blues and the reds are used in a much more sort of abstract, expressionistic way and stuff. So yeah, I tried to sort of mix it up so that it would sort of communicate something to you when you're, it changes.
Thank you. I've got a question about the fashion in it. So obviously coming at it to want to talk about a tennis player and from a like political journalism background, but it's set in such an iconic period, and obviously Suzanne had such an influence on fashion, so presumably you had to become a bit of a fashion historian as well in this. And did you find that, challenging? And I presume it maybe wasn't what you thought. You might be spending a lot of time looking at whalebone corsets and things when you started the book.
Yeah. No, it was really interesting. I really, I don't think I'm incredibly well versed in fashion history, so it was really good to find out a lot about that. Like the tennis world is also really like intrinsically linked with fashion, and having to sort of like learn about that was really interesting. I really liked finding out that in the 1920s that sort of like flapper look and the look that Suzanne was sort of known for was like the garçon look. There's like this the waistlines were came further down while the hemlines came up, and so the idea was like you're creating a like tubular shape, so it was sort of more androgynous, and I guess I'd never really like, even though like that was something I could see when I watched like films about the 20s or films in the 20s. I guess I'd never really associated it with a kind of like slightly, that was part of the intention behind it, was to sort of remove gender from it a little bit as well. It's nice. It's good.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'd just like to ask a question about the sport. So the problem with sports films is often the sport. It doesn't look anywhere near realistic. You know, I've watched many films about sport and the sport just looks rubbish. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm just interested in how you tried to sort of convey the drama of an actual tennis match, you know, on points in an actual graphic novel. Sounds like a real challenge, and I'm looking forward to how you did it. But I wondered if you might just want to say a bit more about that kind of challenge of putting sport on a page.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I tried to look at other comics that used sports or tried to portray sports. Now, there aren't that many in the West. There were lots of sports manga, and I picked up a few volumes of Prince of Tennis, which is great, but absolutely not how I would like any part of my style. I think there was also the temptation to look at superhero comics because all they're interested in is sort of like dynamic action, like, you know, that's all, you know, that's trying to convey a lot of movement and in those pages. So I tried to look at that a little bit, but this didn't dawn on me until I rewatched it quite recently, but rewatched Top Gun. This is going somewhere. But all the dogfights play out like they're radio plays. Like the actual, the action is, you know, very limited. You barely see what's going on in the outside. It's all in the cockpits, and I couldn't tell you what was actually happening when you do see outside. But they're constantly just telling you what's happening. It's like, oh, he's on my tail, this is happening, I'm going to go up, and then I'll try and shoot him. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. But it's really good at making you feel invested. And when you sort of step back from it, you're like, oh, I didn't actually see a huge amount of that. So I was trying to I realized I was sort of doing a bit of that in Suzanne. There's a bit of a kind of, I wanted to be able to make sure that if you didn't know anything about tennis, you could follow what was happening. So there's there are people commentating, but at the time there were no commentators, but, well, maybe there were.
It's just people in the crowd shouting out, isn't it?
Yeah. But I had like people who were invested in the outcome, sort of talking about what was happening on the court as much as I was trying to show it. But I was also like, during the rest of the book, everything is like in quite regimented panel structures, and using like forms of 9-panel grid, and but often like 14 panels or whatever, and it's all quite strict. And when it comes to the matches, everything sort of like opens up a bit, and so you get more sort of like diagonals. People's feet and hands come out of the panels a bit more, and so you get a sense of what's happening there. But I kept on trying to play around with different ways of showing what's happening, almost like an impressionistic version of saying they're coming to the net a lot by drawing them at the net a lot. That doesn't sound very smart, actually, now I think about it. It's better than that. But yeah.
When did you first decide you were going to create a graphic novel, and how much of a time commitment is it?
That's a good question. So I think I started having the idea about 5 years ago, when I just came across like finding out more about her in that book, and I was sort of reading around the subject a lot before I decided it was definitely a story, because for a while, like, you know, various things sort of crop up and you're like, oh, I think there's a story in this, and then you might explore it for a while and realize, oh no, I don't think I can figure out how to do it. And on and off, I was like researching it for about 2 years in the background, while I was also doing illustration work or other smaller comics. But as soon as like I had like all of that done, and I was like sitting down to start writing it like a full script, from that point to a finished book that I sent to the printers was, I'd say, just over 2 years. But that's like 200 pages. And I guess about each sort of like the penciling stage and the inking stage and colouring stage, each of those took about like 4 months, I want to say. But yeah, maybe a bit longer. Yeah, that's about roughly it.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Is there something else to do?
Oh, we can do two. We can do two if there's, yeah.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, if there was I guess, a more modern player that you wanted to maybe like do a sequel on, or like, you know, focus a graphic novel on, like, who would it be? Because I mean, I was just thinking, like, we were talking obviously about the fashion focus in this, and you know, a woman who kind of dominated the game in her prime, like Serena Williams just like retired the other week, and it's like, you know, would that be something you would look at, or is it more the kind of unknown of her story? Because I guess like players nowadays, it's almost impossible. If a player had that successful a career right now, everyone would know, like, their lives would be fully detailed, mapped out online, and easy to find out about. So yeah, I was just curious if that was something you would be interested in doing, or which player would entice you into.
Yeah, I would, but yeah, like you say, it would be tricky to find a player that would. I think maybe it would be trying to find something where you could like get really good access. Like for some reason, when you were talking there, I was thinking about there's a David Foster Wallace essay about, I've forgotten the guy's name, but he was just talking about what it's like to be the 70th best person in the world at something. And so it's like, yeah, like this, I've forgotten his name, it's terrible, but this, you know, this tennis player who's like 70th in the world, and like how good you have to be that, and how someone talking right now isn't going to be able to remember your name, or, you know, like, and, you know, like, I dream of being the 70th best comic artist in the world. Like, so, yeah, I find that really fascinating. So maybe like a story sort of in that, you know, like, or even, I know that they're doing a movie about the Challenger Tour with Zendaya, and I'm really fascinated to see that, because I like the idea of like what it's like to be on the peripheries of it, like what it's like to, yeah, you know, not be a millionaire sort of player. I mean, I'd also really love to know, like, yeah, if you could get like access to be able to be on the other side and find out like what it's like to be in Serena's camp, and like what that, you know, behind the scenes is like. I was just listening to the Racket podcast the other day with Renee Stubbs talking about what it was like to be the coach for those that last week, and yeah, so yeah, I guess that's not a specific answer. But, yeah.
I've got one more I could ask you. What sort of advice would you give to someone who wants to take the plunge and do a graphic novel?
It depends on, I guess, if you want to start making comics, I would just recommend writing and drawing your own comics and starting small. Like, I think I wanted to do a graphic novel about 10 years ago, and I think looking back, I'm really glad that I did lots of smaller things. I feel like I was much more ready to do Suzanne now than I was then, and I feel like to an extent I had to get a lot of bad comics out of me, and it was really good to sort of like get a lot of that practice and really find a voice. But in order to do that, I feel like you have to just draw and keep drawing, and that would be my sort of advice is, find your voice, tell as many stories as you can, and I would listen to podcasts, like process podcasts, there are like specific comic ones that are really interesting where people talk about pens or brushes that they like to use, or the kind of paper they like to work on. But I also find I get a lot out of listening to podcasts where people talk about screenwriting or the writing process, or I actually get quite anxious listening to comic artists talk about the process, because I'm like, oh, I don't do that.
That
Should I be doing
comparison, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas I feel like hearing writers talk, or listening to people talk about cinematography really informs the way that I think about color, and so yeah, I guess I find hearing people talk about the creative process really helps. And there's a small barrier to entry with comics where you can draw something, print it up relatively cheaply with a photocopier and make a zine and take it to zine fairs. And that's also where you meet other people who might be like-minded, and that's a really good start as well, just meeting people you can talk to about the process and collaborate, and yeah.
Cool. I think there was one more thing you wanted to mention about what everyone's getting with their books this season.
Oh yeah, in the books there's a risograph bookplate that is of is kind of like a homage to. Thanks. So it's like a two-color risograph homage to there's a Portobello artist whose name I can't remember, who did the sort of 1920s sort of summer posters encouraging you to come and spend your time in Portobello, and it's I put Suzanne in it, so they're signed and numbered, and yeah.
Well, Tom, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you, and thank you for talking us through the process of Suzanne. So, get a round of applause for Tom.